Fantasy isn't just about having the hope. It really becomes this problem because this imagined future that you have carries more weight than the present moment reality. So, really, we're not ever in a relationship with somebody, with what somebody could become or who they could become. We are always in a relationship with what they're consistently available for now. When it comes to red flags, fantasy is going to encourage you, without you necessarily knowing, to treat patterns as the exception rather than the rule. Don't listen to somebody's story about their own intentions. Watch and observe the repeated effect of their behavior. Welcome back, everybody. So before we get into today's episode, if you are looking to transform your relationships and move from self-abandonment in relationships to deep relational self-trust, we have a bunch of resources in the show notes below, including our free training and access to all of the details on our signature relationship transformation course, Alchemy of Connection. Now, today I want to speak with you all about fantasy relationships and potential relationships because there is a very specific mechanism. There are very specific patterns in the body, the mind, the nervous system that present and that create this attachment to potential rather than this anchoring in reality. And this causes a lot of heartbreak, a lot of confusion, a lot of dysregulation inside of relationships. And this isn't just romantic relationships. This is platonic relationships, work relationships as well. So this is going to help you really start to discern things a lot earlier, see people for who they are, not the potential of who they could be, and really understand the mechanisms of why we create fantasy and attach to fantasy and how it really impacts our ability to work with, create, and manifest what we actually desire in physical reality, whether that's relationships, business, finances, any of that. So, fantasy is this kind of coping mechanism that we develop early on. We'll go into that a little bit later, but it's this coping mechanism, and it becomes a relational problem because we use another person's potential and we use the emotion or the feeling of hope to attach to who somebody could be and ultimately avoid responding to their present moment behavior and the discomfort, the pain, the grief around the reality of how they are actually showing up and who they actually are. So it's really important to understand the difference, and this is what we're going to talk about today, between who somebody consistently is in real time through their behavior versus who they occasionally can be on a really good day or a good day. And also noticing your own patterns of imagination or hope around who you believe they could potentially become. So fantasy isn't just about having the hope or seeing the best in other people, which is what a lot of really loving women tend to do. It really becomes this problem because this imagined future that you have, that you've created in your mind, carries more weight than the present moment reality. And what I mean by that is it carries more weight in terms of its ability to impact your decisions, its ability to impact what you choose to do and how you choose to respond in a relationship. The fantasy is what you're hanging a lot of the relationship on rather than letting present moment reality or the behaviors in real time, what's being demonstrated in real time, hold the weight and impact your decisions, impact how you respond to the other person. So obviously we want the reality that we're living inside of and how people are showing up inside of that reality to have the greatest impact on us, not a imagined reality of how we wish things were. So it's really, really common in these environments, in these dynamics, these relationship dynamics, for women to have a relationship with somebody's words, somebody's intentions. This next one is really important, their wounds. So you'll have this relationship with understanding their wounds. You'll also have a relationship with these rare moments of closeness or intimacy, or this relationship with future potential of who this person could be, all whilst the consistent behavior and present moment reality is telling a very, very different story. And this is why it's easy for people to look from the outside in and wonder maybe what somebody is doing inside of a dynamic, what they see in that person. Because when that attachment system isn't activated, or when somebody's not emotionally invested, or someone isn't being told the things that people are being told inside of these dynamics, like, the things that are bolstering up a person's potential, the false promises, the future faking, all of that kind of stuff. When you look at it from the outside in, it can be a lot easier where there's not that emotional investment, all these attachment patterns aren't activated, to see misalignment, or to see the value of one person being much greater than the value of the other person, and not to say anybody has like more inherent value, but in terms of relational compatibility, who has greater capacity. That's what I mean by value. So having a relationship with their words, with their intentions, with their wounds, with small moments of goodness, or these future ideas versus the consistent behavior in real time, is where a lot of women get stuck, and what we're going to really focus on today. So in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about dissociation. That term might come up a little bit. So if you're not familiar with that term, it really just means that we are using a disconnection from the body, or a disconnection from our present moment reality, to cope when the sensory input, or what we're faced with, the information in the present moment, feels too big, too overwhelming for us to digest and respond appropriately. So it can feel, rather than our senses being open and us being engaged with our environment through our sensory body, if that feels too much, if we're depleted, if we're under-resourced, or the information coming in is overwhelming or scary or confronting, or triggers some sort of wound or trauma response, it can be much easier to disconnect from present moment reality. And dissociation is something that anybody can do when we are overwhelmed, or where we are overburdened by sensory information, and we just want to have a moment of reprieve and kind of zone out and disconnect. However, when we're doing this in relationship in order to avoid the uncomfortable reality, and it's a repeated pattern where we're overlooking red flags, we're not attracting more of what we actually truly want in relationship, then we really have to start looking at that pattern and start healing that pattern, which is what I help you do inside of all of my programs. So really, we're not ever in a relationship with somebody, with what somebody could become or who they could become. We are always in a relationship with what they're consistently available for now. And sometimes that's a really hard truth or hard reality to swallow, but that is what security and secure relationships and self-trust in relationships requires of you. And potential really becomes dangerous when it requires you to avoid or abandon present moment reality. So let's solve some of these issues for you today. So why do we create fantasy-based relationships? So in early childhood, we depend on the people around us. There is no other option. And so we are going to depend on people who are disappointing, who are potentially frightening, who are potentially dysregulated, who are potentially emotionally absent or inconsistent or even abusive. And we don't, as an infant or even a child or even a young adult, have the capacity, the knowledge, or even the embodied power to process the idea that this person can't relationally meet me. We don't have that knowledge to process things like that, or process even the idea that this relationship doesn't feel energetically secure or emotionally secure or physically secure. And we definitely don't have the language or the understanding to say the needs that I have are repeatedly being dismissed, ignored, neglected, and the person I'm trying to get those needs met through is repeatedly hurting or neglecting me. So what we do as a coping mechanism is we preserve hope. And that hope allows us to preserve attachment. This is one of the greatest patterns that I see in really emotionally intelligent women, because they've learned to understand the psychology of people and themselves and how they operate and how other people operate. But then there's this attachment still to potential and this idea that hope itself will somehow create the secure dynamic that on repeat is being shown is not available. So when we're a child, we learn to focus on a caregiver's good moments, their good qualities, their intentions, what they meant to do rather than what they did do. Why? We focus on the wound as to like why they might act this way. We psychoanalyze as we often get older, or even from a really young age, as to try to understand the motivations as to why they might behave like this, especially if they can be cruel or even abusive. It's much more digestible for our psyche and our body and mind to have some sort of answer as to why their motivations would cause them to act like this, versus actually digesting the cruelty or the neglect in the moment. And this is why so many emotionally mature women tend to be able to dissect all kinds of dynamics and people and psychoanalyze things super well, but it's actually a misuse of energy because they don't feel secure. And then the question then becomes, do I not feel secure because I need to, adjust something and just let myself be here? Or is somebody neglecting my needs? Is somebody not meeting me relationally? And to preserve the connection, I'm justifying and I'm psychoanalyzing and I am holding on to hope. And I'm holding on to this fantasy that this person in front of me might finally change. They might finally see me as lovable. They might finally see me as enough or as worthy. And therefore, they might finally give me the love that I deserve. So in adult relationships, this is what happens. And it can become and does become this automatic pattern of understanding the other person instead of actually responding to how their behavior is affecting you in real time. So this is when you're going to often confuse compassion with continued access, and where your energy field becomes porous and you lose connection to your boundaries. You lose that clear channel for your anger that should, turn into boundaries and limitations around access. And you may definitely confuse compassion with access, what we said. And you may also believe that if you just love correctly, love enough, communicate perfectly, become smaller or become easier, or you heal your wounds enough that the relationship will become, what you'd imagined it would become. So it's important to know that when reality threatened the attachment bond in early childhood, fantasy may take over and may have helped you preserve a connection that felt threatened. Then in adulthood, the same strategy of fantasy can help keep you inside of relationships that repeatedly fail to meet you. This is why people settle for breadcrumbs when it doesn't make sense, or chase after something that isn't meeting them. Because there's that pull of like, if I just resolve it here, if I'm just enough, if I just give enough, if I just demonstrate something or heal something, the person will love me in the way that I need. And it overlooks all realms of compatibility. It overlooks all red flags. And it lands us back in that chasing or longing to be met while settling for something that's not truly meeting you or fulfilling you. So some more signs that this can be happening is that you spend more time analyzing their patterns or their childhood or their wounds or who they are and their behaviors and why they act the way they act, versus acknowledging their choices and how they're showing up in real time. You also explain their behavior away. You explain it away to yourself before you fully let the impact of their behavior actually affect you, or you haven't acknowledged the effect of their behavior on you. Before you even acknowledge the impact or the effect, you've gone into justification or explaining. That's a way of repressing what you're feeling in response to how they're behaving, and then creating this idea of who they are, which is helping you cope, but it's not addressing the unfelt feelings, it's not addressing the emotions, and it's not addressing what you truly need to feel secure. It's often common as well as a sign that this might be happening is that you are waiting for the relationship to return to what it was like in the beginning. This can be a common one. It's not always there. It's not always the case, but it can be. You also believe that the relationship is kind of nearly ready to become this thing, to become secure, to become grounded in reality or tangible in some way, but the basic pattern loops and cycles and what you're seeing and how the other person's behaving and how you're responding doesn't really change. So it's like it's almost there. It's almost there, and you feel like there's like that carrot being dangled. And this might be something that you are kind of manufacturing. It's more common that is being fed. I see it much more often that hope is being fed by somebody else's intention, their promises, their words that kind of keep you hooked on the potential. and where words hold more weight around how they're able to impact your choices and your decisions versus the reality of that person and their behavior. Another sign that this can be happening is that you feel really deeply bonded to the person that they are when things are good. Whilst simultaneously being hurt by who they are when they're under stress and who they are when they're good isn't far outweighing who they are when they're under stress. There is no secure relationship when who that person is under stress is taking up way too much time in the relationship dynamic. Who they are when they are good, when they are regulated, should be the vast majority of the time. Because the foundation of your relationship is really built on the worst of somebody, or the worst of ourselves. Like, what's the worst pattern that we engage in? Because that is the foundation. And so even if that's 10 or 20% of the time, that's still impacting, right, the foundation of the relationship. If that's 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the time, there is the foundation is becoming less and less existent, and less secure. So let's talk a little bit more about dissociation and go into that a little bit more. So when the body registers relational information, before we're able to kind of make sense of it, when we do that and it feels too overwhelming purely due to the kind of information that's coming at us or our capacity to meet the information, before we've even made sense of it, we're processing a response to the present moment. And that response, when things are too much, can very simply become, I don't want to be here and I don't want to deal with it. So that doesn't mean that every sensation that's happening in our body is like a truth that we shouldn't be questioning. Like that, there's an ultimate truth in each sensation. It all comes down to the way that we interpret sensory information. And when things are triggered by information coming at us, things like fear, past wounds, our perception of reality, all of that impacts how we then translate the sensory information as to whether we want to be in present moment reality and work with what's happening, or we want to escape. And so discernment really requires combining this bodily information with what's tangible and observable in behavior and real time. We also need to bring in the nuance of context, like what's happening in somebody's life. But again, if the negative is even getting close to outweighing the positive, it shouldn't even be, coming that close. Yes, there can be a season, but we are meant to pour into a relationship bucket first and fill the cup of the relationship with trust, with consistency, with security, so that when times are tough and we're stretched and stressed, there is space to move. If there's not enough pouring in, there's not enough investment, and there's more taking out, it's going to have a detrimental impact on the relationship. And this is often where people get access to women in relationship that shouldn't have access, because she was just there because she was so used to dissociating and disconnecting from what was available in present moment reality that she stayed. And so we need to combine the bodily information with the observable behavior, bring in some context, and also just watch repeated patterns over time. This is why we don't want to rush things. You need time to see, is there enough being poured in? How do they handle stress? What's the overall pattern that I'm observing and how they navigate life, relationships, challenges, all of those things. And dissociation doesn't necessarily need to be this really dramatic thing. It can be. It can feel like a big disconnect from reality, from your body. In extreme cases, it can feel like you're kind of floating above your reality and observing it from the external. But it can also just be this subtle thing of feeling disconnected from your sensory relationship with present moment reality. So it can look like the constant analysis. It can look like the future planning. It can look like the obsessive meaning making. It can look like fixating on somebody's potential versus the reality of things. It can look like losing connection to your own needs and your own feelings. It can look like holding resentment and tension, but not knowing how to communicate boundaries or needs in relationship. It can feel like you're going blank when somebody crosses a line rather than feeling connected to how it's impacting you. And it can also feel like you are automatically minimizing your discomfort. And so you leave your body and you enter this interpretation mode because that interpretation or that meaning making feels much more manageable than the feelings, the anger, the fear, the disappointment, the grief, the connection, whatever's there and present in the body. So we leave the body and we enter the realm of interpretation, because interpretation, analyzing, meaning making is going to feel more manageable than making sense of the information that's moving through the body. So whether that's grief, hurt, anger, fear, disappointment, connection, all of those things, it can feel much easier to disconnect from those things and go into some form of analyzing or some form of disconnection from the felt body and the senses rather than staying in connection with them. So what I mean by digesting reality really just means we are able to, with enough, conscious awareness as possible, we're able to notice what happened. We're able to notice what we felt. We're able to allow emotional responses. We're able to decide and discern what that information then means for us and how we want to respond, what decisions we want to make, how we want to act, and how to then take the appropriate action for us. So reality isn't processed just because you understand why somebody behaves the way that they do. Reality is processed when you can respond to how their behavior makes you feel and respond to what that means for you and take appropriate action that takes care of yourself and your needs. So this idea that we're processing relationship or processing reality at a deeper level through the analyzing is not always true. It absolutely can be, but if that is done as a way to avoid actually responding and making decisions that work for you and are in your best interests and meet your needs, then the analyzing becomes the coping mechanism itself. Because our body doesn't want us to be forever analyzing relationships. It's not the state that we should be in. It's not the state we want to be in, especially in a secure position. That's not the state of what that looks like. Secure relationship is where our body is asking us to act and respond, and we are listening to those cues and responding accordingly in a way that keeps us in insecure environments. So let's talk a little bit about what fantasy and hope and these patterns that we've discussed does to red flags, what it does to boundaries, what it does to standards, and what it does to our needs in relationship. So fantasy, when it comes to red flags, is going to encourage you, without you even really knowing it, to treat patterns as the exception rather than the rule. I want you to listen to that again. When it comes to red flags, fantasy is going to encourage you, without you necessarily knowing, to treat patterns as the exception rather than the rule. So you're going to focus on when it's good, or you're going to focus on the apology rather than how the pattern shifts or if it shifts, or how the pattern presents and if it changes and gets better over time. Fantasy, when it comes to red flags, is also going to make you treat emotional disclosure as evidence of emotional capacity. Those are not the same things. Emotional disclosure can be this analyzing of patterns. Capacity, as we spoke about, is the ability to be emotionally connected from the body and responding with maturity and security, and clearly and with clarity and with speed to what our body is communicating with us. When it comes to red flags, fantasy is also going to kind of encourage you to mistake being able to describe or analyze their wounds for them being willing to take responsibility for them. Again, different things. And you're also in that state going to place greater importance on the intention rather than the repeated effect of the behavior. So it's excusing things because, that's not their intention. Intention, everybody has really good intentions. Everybody, even people that are incredibly cruel, will say that their intentions are not to hurt people. Everybody's intentions are good. Yes, I'm sure there's a spectrum of the quality of people's intentions, for sure. But you ask anybody, and they'll say, but that wasn't my intention. So intention really doesn't, yes, of course, the intention can be different. We can set a higher standard for our intention and a higher level of cleanliness or integrity around our intention. That's definitely possible, and what happens and what should be happening. However, don't listen to somebody's story about their own intentions. Watch and observe the repeated effect of their behavior. So someone can understand themselves really deeply and still be unable or unwilling to build healthy relationships. Those two things, whilst I'm sure there is like a bit of an overlap in terms of emotional maturity and having better relationships, I also see a lot of the analyzing in really, really dysfunctional relationship dynamics. Let's talk about what fantasy does to boundaries. So boundary is not an attempt to control another person or change their behavior. It's about naming what we'll do and how we'll respond if a certain behavior continues or if a certain behavior occurs. Fantasy-based boundaries often kind of sound firm, but there's no consequence or no repercussion. There's no action. There's no follow-through. And so an example of this might be requesting something. So I need you to stop doing this thing, stop disrespecting me, or stop disappearing when I need you, or stop disappearing after conflict, or a request that's being repeated. That's like I said, that's a request. A boundary is an emotionally inconsistent relationship does not work for me. It's not on the cards for me. So if this continues in this way, I will step away. And then you follow through on that boundary. There has to be an action. There has to be a consequence. So if you're not willing to wear the loss because of, or the change in dynamic because of how you perceive that, or how much hope or fantasy you're attaching to that relationship working out in a certain way, the boundary is going to be really hard or impossible for you to hold and follow through on. So a boundary is only a boundary and only becomes meaningful, it only becomes true when you're actually willing to act on it. It's not a boundary if it's a suggestion, then it's a preference, it's a request. Fantasy with standards, also fantasy really has that impact on your standards in the same way. So standards aren't just these qualities that you say that you want. They're the minimum conditions required for somebody to have continued access to you. They're also the standards, the minimum requirements that you have for yourself. You can't ask somebody to have a particular standard for their health, their wealth, their relationships, their life, their integrity, their values, if that's not the minimum that you are showing up to and preserving for yourself. So you may have high standards, but low in like concept, like high standards in fantasy or high standards as an idea, but low standards when it comes to actually upholding them and holding the boundaries around them in reality. So when those behaviors maybe come up, even though you've got this idea about what you deserve, what you're worthy of, where your standards lie, if you remain available regardless of what is happening in front of you, then the standards remain as an idea, as an intention. And so your standard isn't what you say you deserve, what you demand, what you conceptualize, what you fantasize about. It's what you stop participating in when that standard is not met. So let's just talk a little bit about why letting go of fantasy and potential can feel so painful. So you're not, and I've spoken about this in previous episodes, it's really important to bring it here, in that you're not just grieving a person, you're grieving the weight of a reality that you placed upon that dynamic. So you're grieving a future that you imagined. You're grieving a version of yourself who would finally be chosen. You're grieving the hope that this relationship would become something, or it would repair something. You're grieving the energy, the time, the resources, the money that you have invested. You're grieving the belief that love and patience and effort would eventually be rewarded. And so fantasy can really protect us from that sense of helplessness, that sense of disappointment, that sense of grief. Because as long as the person has this potential that you imagine them to be, and they may, everybody has incredible potential, very few people live up to it. So as long as this person has this potential that you're attaching to them, then there's reason to keep investing. when we start to let go of that potential or that fantasy, the reality can actually start to hit us, which is where we want to be, but we also have to be in a place where we're secure enough and have enough resource and capacity and tools to start to meet that reality when it kind of starts to come crashing down a little bit. So accepting reality may mean that we acknowledge there's nothing more that we can do. There's nothing more we can invest, nothing more we can say, nothing extra we can do to create reciprocity in a relational dynamic. And also the familiar instability can also feel emotionally significant. It can feel inflated because it resembles that earlier attachment pattern and those earlier experiences. So we can inflate that to be far more meaningful or fated than it actually is. So those are just some ways that we want to kind of understand what the fallout might be on the other side of deconstructing or coming out of a relationship where there are these patterns of fantasy or these patterns of holding on to hope. This is very, very important that we understand these things. So there's also this really important thing that I want to touch on here, which is the way that we attach fantasy to our identity. And sometimes this can be one of the harder things to digest and unravel that I see with clients. I experienced it in myself in the past, and I also see this in clients, and it can be one of the trickier parts of creating these more secure, sovereign relationship patterns and standards. So you might attach in different ways. It can be different for different people, but examples might be, I'm the woman who can finally see who he is or can finally love this person the way they need to be loved. And that can come through the wounds that they hoped you would fix, the ways they tried to hook you in and hooked you through your compassion, your empathy. So I'm going to be that woman that he needs because that's where his pain is. And if I can heal that, or their pain, if I can heal that, then they'll finally choose me. So it could also be things like, that person needs me, or I am the one person that person feels like they can, open up to, or if the connection is too deep for us to give up on, or leaving means that I've failed. That's a very, very big one. I failed at resolving this pattern, and I failed here, and that can really represent that early childhood wound. It's really important to just give ourselves grace whilst we might have failed at achieving what we set out to achieve. If we're not willing to sit in that space of failure, of this didn't work, the disappointment, the grief, then we will often repeat that pattern many, many, many more times. And also there might be an attachment, or that there's quite likely an attachment to this idea of, if this person finally chooses me, then it proves that I'm finally enough, rather than finding that sense of enoughness inside of our everyday actions and things that we do to fulfill ourselves. So the relationship may therefore be protecting an identity, a version of ourselves that has kept us alive, has kept us safe, has kept us functional in the world, not just the attachment itself. And so, to create security, we have to deconstruct that identity and build a new, more aligned one. So quickly before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about the process of building capacity to respond to reality rather than sitting in fantasy. So this is more of a practical process rather than it being quite light, like lean in more or just leave the relationship. So we want to practice regulating ourselves enough to be able to remain present inside of our relationships and remaining present in a variety of different situations. The people that are going to succeed the most are the ones that are willing to build capacity in a way that they are putting their body and mind under, predictable stress or controlled stressful environments. So we build the nervous system up by adding stress and integrating it in ways that challenge us but are controlled. And so that can be having difficult conversations with people that you feel secure with. It means like exercising, weight training, adding stress to the body, the tissues, challenging your body to move in different ways, challenging yourself to show up and be seen and visible in different ways. So we're stretching our capacity to do new things, to try new ways of being, to add stress in ways that we can integrate it and, like we said before, kind of digest it. So the more that we're stretching ourselves and making sure that we're integrating that stress, the easier it is for us to remain present in a variety of different challenging dynamics. So this is going to allow us to pause before we enter analysis or meaning making or fantasy or even confrontation when we're triggered. So ways we can do that are the ways that I've said before, but it's also just feeling your body, connecting with your feelings, connecting with your sense of groundedness, connecting with the things that give you a sense of goodness and resource, an ability to regulate our breath and remain physically present and engaged through our senses and our felt body in this body. So that's why regulation isn't about kind of creating this acceptance that, we have to convince ourselves that something's acceptable or it's okay. That's often repression. There's a lot of mind activity. There's a lot of convincing. There's a lot of analyzing. Then usually something needs to be felt and moved through. And we're doing that in order to keep something contained or repressed. And I did a whole episode called about repression versus regulation that you can also listen to, which will be very helpful. So building capacity is also going to help you and enable you to become present enough to choose your next action rather than doing things that you're not really present to. So reacting or acting in certain ways that you don't really feel like you have agency or choice around. But you can't fully anchor in, making the choices of how you're moving and interacting with your reality. And we also don't want to be using regulation as a way to postpone action, right? We just want to build the regulations so that we can discern more immediately, more quickly, based on how it works for us, because we're able to stay present and discern more simply and clearly. In no ways is regulation about tolerating more crap. And remaining calm in shitty or harmful situations. It's building the internal stability to act on what is going to keep you secure, resourced, vital, joyful. And so really investing in building that capacity is your greatest tool. And one of the foundational things that I do with everybody that we work with. And so let's wrap it today. So much there for you to take away around this dynamic of fantasy and potential relationships. And if you're ready to go deeper, jump into the show notes. We've got the free resources and all of the information around our signature relationship transformation program, Alchemy of Connection, which is going to move you from self-abandonment in relationships to deep relational self-trust. And I'll see you next week.